Welcome to Being Becoming Podcast. Together, we are being honest in conversations about thoughts we're having and books we're reading, in the hopes of becoming better, more able versions of our current selves. My name is Logan Hauer. I'm joined today by my two good friends and co-hosts, Austin Stone and Patrick Dyer. Today, we'll be discussing Chapter 5, Do Not Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them, from 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos by Jordan Peterson. This is Chapter 5 of our book review that we've been doing, and have had a lot of good conversations here. I think, fellas, we faced our biggest challenge yet in that disclaimer, none of us are parents, and while we stole our children at heart, we do not have any children. So take that with a grain of salt. But I think there were some really good practical guidelines for when we are in that situation or in that phase of life that are useful in thinking about and talking about in this discussion. And I'll turn it over to you guys to get your initial thoughts or just anything to what I've said in the intro so far.
Yeah, I enjoyed Chapter 5. I didn't feel like it was just a chapter for parenting, or at least I know I had something to learn from it.
Like what?
Yeah, I would love to. So Jordan Peterson gives a Sigmund Freud quote. Freud is a very famous psychologist, and it's a quote about a son and a mother. And this was on page 115. So, a man who has been the indisputable favorite of his mother keeps for life the feeling of a conqueror, that confidence of success that often includes real success.
Whoa.
There you go.
And he was saying this could be either good or bad, because a conqueror can overcome in good ways, but it can also run over other people also.
Pat, what were some of your initial thoughts or any, if you had like some practical wisdom or just anything that Austin and I have said so far off the top?
I guess I don't have anything significant to add quite yet. I'm scanning through to see what I've highlighted, and they're all just little sentences that don't mean too much, but
How about you, Logan? What's on the top of your mind when you finish this chapter?
Well, so I think something funny that we could talk about up top is the whole premise of a man who is the favorite of his mother. The child who wins his mother's favor is that conqueror, is like confident to be successful, and then that confidence, whether it's real or not, manifests into actual success. I don't think he cited any statistics or anything on that. Maybe that was just anecdotal. I don't know if you guys have any first thoughts.
I just can't think of any category of human that is so endlessly encouraging, for the most part, in general, than moms, Shout out to moms. I mean, it's not even Mother's Day. Come on. They're just biologically, psychologically, emotionally situated to just keep pushing you, keep pushing encouragement and belonging, and,
Yeah.
if no one else in the world, but your mom can support you, that seems to be all that you need. And I do want to be sensitive to those, and that's not always the case. People don't always have a mother, but I think there is something worth acknowledging here.
oh no, I think he froze.
Well, for the listener at home, Austin has conveniently decided to freeze up after making a great point about mothers. Don't know when he'll be back, but I figure we might as well push on with a couple more thoughts and then just have him jump back in. So
Perhaps.
I guess, Pat, one of the next things that I wanted to bring up, and Austin can just hop on whenever he does to join back in, but I thought another point that stuck out to me in this chapter, which was kind of towards the beginning, was Peterson talking about the little things that kind of occur every day is what truly makes up our lives. It's not these one-off experiences. It's the habitual, predictable occurrences, and they seem trivial And that's what most people are so involved in their own lives that they either take for granted or can't appreciate the importance of those little things. I am one of those people, so that particular point struck me very well. I consider it challenging because I think of my job in the corporate accounting world. It's easy for me to dismiss the importance of what I do, but really it's the question of, if you're not being satisfied, what are the things you're doing every day that are making you feel that way? Feel like you're not achieving well, or you're not doing well socially, or whatever. And then if you look at, how you're spending your days, I think that'll be a good indication of what needs to change, or give you a better understanding of who you are and how you're spending your time.
Good point. Very good beginning.
Thank you.
It's also, you could also say, well, like the title of the book, why would you let yourself do anything you don't like? If we're talking about our daily habits and whatnot, if your aim is set high, well, let's try to think about that. Why would we do things we don't like anyway? Immediate thing is convenience.
It's difficult to do the things you want to do, I think, in short. But back to kind of what you were saying, why would you never do something?
Why would you let yourself do something you don't like?
So that I could take that two ways, I think. The first way is more the Paul quote. That would be more in the sense of, I am upset with myself because I'm doing things that I don't like. But then you could also take it in more of maybe a positive spin of, there are these things that I don't like doing, like working out is hard, for me. And it's like, I don't like doing it, but like, why am I doing it? Or why am I trying to do it? And that's more of like a healthy, achieving kind of way of thinking about it, where it's, I have this aim that I've set high. I know that it's worthwhile, but I don't like doing the thing that causes me to get to that desired destination.
For sure. The better way to say it is, potentially a better way is, don't let yourself do anything that makes you dislike yourself.
Oh.
That's the better way to say it. Because now we're opening that door to habitual sins and sins of omission.
And maybe our listener at home doesn't know what a sin of omission is, and I might not even myself. So do you mind maybe explaining that a little bit?
A sin of omission is not doing something you know you should. Jordan Peterson he even says, this is not biblically speaking. It might be, but Jordan Peterson says somewhere in this book and many quotes on his podcast that when you have something to say and you don't say it, that is a sin of omission.
You saying that takes me back to a discussion we had a couple chapters ago about, not standing up for yourself in the sake of being this virtuous, compassionate person thinking of others. You're really not taking care of others well if you're not taking care of yourself and standing up for yourself and saying your piece.
Yeah.
That was very challenging for me personally. I think that might have been chapter 2 or 3 discussion.
It's kind of hard to think about critically, because you have to change afterwards.
Yeah, you have to not only look at yourself in the mirror very seriously, but then once you discover the thing that needs to be changed, you need to act on it.
Yeah.
I'm thankful now in life I have a better idea of what my limitations are, or my vices, I guess, too, as well.
Definitely.
And I can not only be aware of them, but I can actively try to take steps that mitigate or even eradicate some of those, unpleasantries about myself. This isn't to say that I do it all perfectly every day, or that I even might get rid of those once and for all, but I think building that trust with yourself and trying to be diligent in understanding who you are better, and then trying to empower yourself to take on more difficult aspects of yourself that you deem might need changing. Yeah, I think that's all worthwhile.
100%. And it reminds me of how much I don't like when people say you're okay the way you are. Like we've also talked about, how can you read this chapter, quote the title chapter, aiming toward yourself, and then actually pursue that and then think you're okay? That's so arrogant, actually. Yeah, that's putting yourself above the people trying to change that in themselves, but that may or may not be right. But regardless, it appears to be arrogant. Let's challenge that idea of accepting people for who they are. Why would you accept someone for who they are if you dislike them?
If you can't accept someone for who they are, or at least let's say if you can't understand their motivations or who they want to be or how they perceive the world, which given we're never going to be able to fully understand all those things, but let's just say for the sake of discussion or this situation that you're wanting to understand what it is about them that you don't like, you need to know enough about them to know why you guys don't like each other. So it's easy to dislike someone that you just don't get along with, but if you try to understand where they're coming from, or honestly finding that point of commonality, something you're both passionate about, that can alleviate or eliminate a lot of those unpleasant first meetings or first exchanges or what have you.
No, that definitely makes sense, and it just reminds me simply of do not judge lest you be judged.
Boom, even better, way shorter. And he's back, Austin Stone, back from the interwebs of the space-time continuum. The internet web connection has been fixed. All right, fellas. Well, Pat posed the point of how interacting with people that you deem to be unlikable. I think we had a really good conversation about that, but I wanted to pivot the talk back into chapter 5 of Peterson's book and talk about this notion of Rousseau, who was a philosopher, kind of painting this picture of children being these all virtuous beings, and that should they just be left alone, they would blossom into fully formed adults that were perfect, but it's society or it's the influence of other adults or other things that you can't control that kind of warps them. Do we kind of hold children too high in this regard as far as being virtuous? The innocence of a child is obviously something that is so precious, but I thought it was interesting how he kind of challenges the idea of the divine child, quote unquote, is the way he puts it. Curious to get your guys' thoughts.
There's something that Peterson has said in his podcasts that 2-year-olds are statistically the most violent humans. That's the most violent age. So that seems to kind of go right up against Rousseau's Butterflies and Rainbows belief that human nature, is kind of perfect if it's untainted.
That's a great point, Austin.
It's like their default is to lie and be annoying.
One of the things he also brings up that I find interesting is that if you're not doing the parenting in the home, or I guess the way he kind of puts it, if you're a parent that's sensitive to short-term emotional suffering of children, so you don't want to punish them for doing wrong, or you're going to let them get away here and there, and then later they pay those lessons in society or in school or at their job because they weren't being corrected when they were first coming up as a child. So I thought that was a very interesting point, and that how young socialization begins in kids. He was saying the primary sphere of influence for children is their peers starting after the age of 4. It's no longer the household at that point, which I thought was a really young age.
That's scary.
Very young.
I think it's interesting because you could already start paying the consequences of those social effects from your not fully developed behaviors at that age, potentially, because children aren't going to want to play with children that are not sharing or overly physical, or if you're not fun to be around, people aren't going to want to be around you. I think that's another point that he brings up that I kind of found interesting, where even if you're not a social person, when you're in a social situation, you don't have to be like the most fun person, but just be fun to be around. And then you'll get invited to more things, and then that'll raise your confidence. And it's almost self-explanatory, but it's interesting to put language behind it.
I'm out of my expertise here, but it seems as though that a 2-year-old kind of has raw ego, and a good parenting relationship should be able to, integrate that over time. The world is not just about you and your needs and your wants. There are other people, and there are times for this and times for that, and I think if that ego goes unchecked, maybe not the best person or most healthy person to be around.
Freud calls it the id.
The id.
So what does that mean, Patrick? Could you delve into that a little bit?
Yes, hopefully I'm not too wrong. The id is your expedient self, your initial emotion, your initial reaction kind of. So off that's not technically true, but like I'm trying to think of an example. Dang it. You stub your toe, curse, yell, boom. That's your id taking over. It's the quick thought process. Your ego would be the one controlling after you stub your toe, not saying anything, because you know it won't help anything. And your super ego is the one who influences your ego to like hold the swearing down or whatever. If there's a psychologist that just heard me say that, they would probably be tossing and turning. But that's more or less an idea of it. Or like the id also is like the glutton. You can't stop yourself from eating so much of whatever it may be. The ego helps control that influence from the super ego. So your decision maker should be the ego, more or less. Parents are trying to hone the id.
I think Peterson also makes a really good point about parenting, and I think parents think they're doing their children a favor when they go the easy way out, but he, through examples, showed that that's, not a long-term solution. Like, giving what the child wants in that moment might actually make you resentful towards them later, and not saying anything.
Yeah.
And I think he talks about, a popular belief is to kind of like let children do their own thing. Like, I think it is kind of a Rousseauian thing where it's like, just let them learn on their own, let them do their own thing, like try not to say no to them. And I think some of that is healthy because it doesn't completely crush creativity, but if you don't have any guidelines, don't have any rules, and you're not able to say no, then I think he has a good point that you could become resentful toward your own child, and that wouldn't be good either.
Such a fine balance. Such a fine balance.
Along the lines you were talking about, Austin, and we'll probably experience this one day, but us being naive people of the parenting situations, it is interesting to me how many parents want to be the friend of the child as opposed to being the parent, because he brought up a good point. You only have two parents at best if they're both involved in your life or in the picture, but you have hundreds of friends, throughout your life, if not more than that, or, less than that, depending on the person. But I thought that was really profound. Like, the role of the parent is very important. It shouldn't be relegated or conflated with another role of something that's more common. Even though us three, we're all very big advocates for friendship and think it's very important. But I just thought that was an interesting distinction that he makes.
I don't think friendship should be the only defining factor of a parenting relationship. I definitely think it can be a factor.
Yeah.
And you have to know, and that friendship factor might fluctuate, depending on the child's age as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking that too, Austin, because we're all 26-ish years old. So we're at that point now where we are more on friendly terms with our parents. It's less parenting from them and more, how's your week going? Oh, I remember being there. Or a lot more of that, a lot more relatability, something more closely resembling a friendship than them constantly instructing us on what to do and solving our problems for us. But if you guys don't mind, I do want to push it into the natural next question, which is, we've recognized now that we want our children to behave within the household, within society. It's easier for them. They could face a lot more obstacles if they're not being experienced to these expectations at a younger age. But one of the natural consequences or side effects of having children learn how to become good citizens in society is discipline and, punishment potentially. I know that there are probably varying opinions on this by experts, but I will be truthfully honest, it's not something that I've really thought about very much at all. I mean, I think it's good. Discipline is good. It's an act of responsibility. And it's important that Peterson points out too, it's not an anger at misbehavior, which is how I think a lot of people interpret discipline. But discipline is actually an act of responsibility. The parent is never taking enjoyment in disciplining the child. Theoretically, in theory, they should not be excited to discipline a child, or definitely don't want to be angry at the misbehavior. But I think that's pretty natural to be upset at the child as you're disciplining them. So maybe that's where that conflation happens of us interpreting discipline as anger instead of as parents thinking for your long-term betterment. But I think discipline requires effort. It requires attention from the parent, watching the child carefully. Again, this is someone who knows absolutely nothing about the area he's talking about, but kind of based on the way Peterson's lining this out and the limited experience I have in life in my 26 years so far, these are kind of these are kind of things that I think can be very necessary for discipline, I should say, is necessary for the child figuring out right from wrong. And children do need constraints. I know we were talking about the divine child in air quotes and how that's kind of a silly, foolish idea of the nature of what a child is. Although, again, we do admire the innocence and the newness of everything that a child experiences. But children do need constraints, and I'm well out of my water here, so I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts on any of this.
All right. Okay, so what I was going to ask is why do we think we don't have the right to say anything just because we don't have kids?
The right to say anything in public when you see another child acting out, is that what you're saying?
No, to criticize this chapter, pretty much. To say, like, because Logan said like 3 or 4 times, like, I have no idea what I'm talking about, which isn't actually true. Of course he does. He's been a child himself, right, and he's had experience with parents. And if he were to have kids, I'm sure he would be a great parent because of his parents, and he knows what he is aiming at, what he wants, and all these things. So I think it's just a safety valve just in case someone were to disagree.
So you're saying trust yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Because I don't have kids. I don't want kids. But I think I definitely could speak on the behalf of parents, probably. Now, sure, that might be arrogant, but I was a kid. I had 2 really good parents, great grandparents, or wonderful grandparents, and really nice great grandparents. There we go. And so we have room to talk, for sure. It's, man, I hate how I say this, and I definitely shouldn't say it in the podcast, but too late. Just like, there's so many people, especially our age, that should not be parents.
Okay.
Even people that wanted to be parents. As it relates to what you just brought up about society.
It's funny how belonging begets babies. A desire for belonging and a desire for intimacy, that's where babies should be coming from, and they often come from a desire to find that as well. And
wait, so where do babies come from?
A desire for belonging.
Mama.
That's my answer.
That's such a great point, though. That's true. Very
the birds
valid.
and the bees and belonging. There you go.
Well, so Logan, I was asking us, all of us, why do we think we don't have the right to say anything just because we're not parents?
That's a fair question, because I do feel like I've been trying to make points, or at least reiterate Peterson's points, and then I immediately back off. Whoa, what do I know? I think people that aren't parents can make points about parenting. I just know for me specifically, I haven't given it much thought, if at all. So that's why I feel not embarrassed, but almost not even guilty. But yeah, I guess I just don't feel confident. I like discussing all this, but then I'm like, I don't know what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have the experience. I haven't even thought about it or talked about it much. So
okay. All right, I'm with you now. I'm with you. I was saying I think we definitely know more than what we're giving credit. We've all been children. We've been parented by good parents. We see bad parents parent kids, and those kids turn out not good. So it's not like we don't know what we're saying, is what I think, at least.
Might I ask a question so that we could segue into society, punishment, discipline?
Of course.
Is discipline important to have in a healthy society, or do you not need it?
are you asking should society be responsible for disciplining people?
That's my question.
Okay.
You got thoughts, Pat?
Initially, to answer the first question, I would say, yeah, of course, discipline's necessary. But I was thinking, according to the law, like police and stuff like that. I went to the extreme, but I'm trying to think of trying to meet in the middle, reel it back. So I don't know yet. I guess perhaps my thoughts will formulate as we continue.
That is an interesting point, though, Pat, piggybacking out off of the police thing, because they, in essence, ideally should be representing society in a manner that's finding people that are breaking laws, and then they're the ones distributing the punishment, discipline, to those offenses. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mitt?
I asked the question broadly because I think there's different levels to discipline, and I think this kind of connects to something that Peterson has said is you don't get away with anything ever. So I think what he's saying with that is there is psychological punishment when you cross the line. So this is where I want Logan to talk about the book that he's reading, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. So you've read more of it than I have, Logan.
Wow.
What do you think is communicated in this fiction book about psychological, what would you call it? Psychological punishment, or like you just can't get away with things?
Torment.
Psychological torment.
It's torment. Yeah. From the very beginning of the book, you get an idea of Raskolnikov. I don't know how to say the Russian right. I always think of him as Rascal because he's kind of a bad guy. But he's not even a bad guy. He's someone that's been led astray in isolation to captivating thoughts that were prevalent at the time that the book was written. So I'm now in the second to last chapter of that book, or it's in parts, so like the second to last part, and to see where the character's at now, he's kind of finally admitting to someone a crime that he's committed, and just the psychological toil that he goes through to get to that point is unbearable. He's trying to justify what he's doing, but then he realizes that justification is poor. And then he's making up a new justification, but then that one is not strong. And the other one sounded better, but the other one wasn't true. But then this justification doesn't merit the crime that he would committed, which is a murder. And
Whoa.
yeah, so it's bad ideology that's then compounded on isolation, that's then a little bit of desperation, a little bit of just being rash or like not thinking like in the moment. I can't think of there's a word I'm trying to get.
Impulsive.
But essentially just impulsive. He acts impulsively and then does this thing, and then it sends him into a physical sickness, not to mention the mental torment that he goes through. But yeah, it's just a very, very detailed account, and I'm very excited to finish the book. But needless to say, that's someone that you never want to become, or even remotely. But oddly enough, you can sympathize and maybe even empathize with the character, and you can kind of understand where he's thinking, or you could understand how if you were in that situation, you'd be trying to make similar justifications for your wrong action.
So I think the psychological torment is a form of discipline on an individual level. And then you've also got, in healthy society, you should have families that, parent children well. And, that process is not always perfect, but hopefully there's healthy forms of discipline there. But then there's, on a larger scale, there's a society often has a government, and that government has a branch for criminal justice, and this includes prisons. So before I ask a question about prisons, I would like to hear your thoughts on those different levels of discipline. And do you have any thoughts on that, Patrick?
I guess so. Probably not a good one, but it just makes me think of the question I asked earlier, or the thought rather. It's just like there's so many people that, in my estimation, should not be parents, just due to probably an arrogant, selfish perspective of producing a child that's bad for society.
So you think that parents or to-be parents should, or people who should check themselves before they, like, are you saying they should
Have
take
children?
parenting more seriously? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah, probably. Wanting to have a kid just to have a kid is an awful idea. If you're not ready to if you're not ready to parent them into society the way it ought to be done, which is hopefully someone who's more or less confident in themselves, but someone who's not putting others down. Especially if we look at it scripturally, just someone who's more or less loving, not putting others down, working hard at whatever they so choose to do, being creative, stuff like that. But all in all, I mean, there's less of that going on than there is more of it. And a lot of it's, I'm assuming, just people wanting, or one, being dumb and having a kid when you're not ready. And that probably happens a lot. Or having a kid because you wanted one, but you yourself as an individual are not ready for that responsibility. Because it's a huge deal. It really is a huge deal. It's towing the line of some scary territory, because there's a lot of things we could, or I could say, that would not be good.
Yeah, and abortion factors into this, and it becomes, quite complex of an issue.
Oh, that's true. That's true too. But I mean, I got lucky. I would say my parents, I mean, I'm the third child, but even with my oldest sibling, I would say they were probably ready. That's what it seems like from my perspective. They may say something different, but...
Can I run something past you guys, kind of piggybacking off of that, Pat?
Of course.
There's a statistic I heard, which I believe to be true, that the marriage rates in the U.S. and definitely other countries as well are dropping. The fertility rate is dropping. Is this an indication that times are changing and that people might be more focused on their careers? Or do you think it's simply a matter of people coming to terms with you're talking about, Pat, and saying, I'm not ready at 22 to get married and start a family, and I'm going to push that off to when I am? And I understand that this is probably a question that we can't fully address, but I'm curious to get your guys' thoughts.
Here's the problem.
We definitely can't fully address it, but that's a great question.
Here's the problem, Patrick. You can't be a good parent if it hasn't been modeled well for you. Like, you can't. It's hard to be what you aren't able to see.
So you're not saying you can't be a good parent if you didn't have a good parent. You're saying you need to learn the model somewhere at some point. It doesn't need to be your parent necessarily.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, here's an actual question. How do you know how to be a good parent when you didn't have good parents? That's a
great question. I mean, that's so
I don't
good.
think that we really can even speak on this because we all had good parents,
No, probably not. Yeah.
I think that's kind of a question you have to respect.
That's tough. Yeah, it's crazy tough. Yeah, I agree 100%.
I've heard, so one of the podcasts I listened to, one of the hosts had not great parents, but was able to learn. And again, that's like, how does this happen? Which I think is an interesting conversation, but was able to learn from their mistakes and he's a great parent. Like, he didn't do those things. He didn't bring those things forward. But to your point, Austin, he probably had to have learned, even though he knew what not to do, he probably had to learn what to do from somewhere else, I would assume.
Yeah.
Even though he obviously hasn't gone into that in the podcast, but...
I've met people who didn't have people in their family who... Sorry. I'm just thinking about...
it's okay.
I'm thinking about responsible sex and people who just have not seen responsible sex done in their family done in their high school. You know, they just don't know what it means to wait, or to have sex responsibly, to wait until you feel like you're with someone who could help you parent a child.
Even if you do have good parents, it's really easy to, just give in to a trade-off of a one-night thing, but then that one night turns into more, and then maybe you have teenage pregnancy, and then that definitely complicates, even though you might have grown up in a really good environment, a good home, whatever. I think it definitely, like, having a kid that young presents a lot of challenges to where you would be able to, for one, stay together with the partner, and then two, to raise the child while also finishing school. And I think you're just setting up a lot more difficulty doing it that way. I've also heard a study that I can't remember where the study's from, but if you want to avoid poverty in the U.S., there's like 3 things you need to do. It's graduate high school, don't have a kid before you're married, and then hold a job. It doesn't matter what the job is, just have a job. Do those 3 things and you'll be above the poverty line.
Yeah. Hopefully you don't develop an addiction that becomes financially expensive.
Right.
True.
That could probably ruin those 3
Right.
things, but yeah, I
That's for sure.
think it's hard to argue with that, Logan. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
And I hope no one feels as though we're peddling in condemnation. I don't think that is something we're seeking.
That's
to
what
do.
it sounds like.
Oh, really?
Well, that's what I sound like, because that's all. I don't mean to sound like that, but
No, because I think, again, we're talking about setting a high aim. Obviously, between the 3 of us, we have a majority of our friends were that way, either having sex before married or having kids out of wedlock. But, if we're talking about where are we aiming, it's like all of our friends would probably say that that's not how they envision their life, even though they love it and wouldn't trade anything. But, I guess we're talking about theoretical ideals. We're talking about the application, since none of us have the experience in those things. But I think this is one of the reasons, too, I'm excited to have guests on that can maybe speak to some of these things, where some of the guests that come on will be able to shed light for us in different areas. So,
which would be very, very good. But I want to go back to the point you made right before we got off on that tangent, was declining birth rates, falling marriage rates, stuff like that. Yeah. And I can't remember, you asked a question. I can't remember what the question was related to that, though.
So would you attribute that declining rate in a change of interest, in the sense of jobs becoming more career oriented, or kind of like young, hanging out with friends, that sort of thing? Or do you attribute it to something more closely approximating, I understand the responsibility of what it takes to raise children, so I'm going to delay that intentionally, and I'm going to have fewer of them because it is a responsibility? And I mean, there's also an argument. A lot of people say now that when you're in more of an industrious area, you're not having as many kids. Do you think it's something more behaviorally that's changing in culture, or do you think it's more of an understanding within the psyche?
I have no clue.
Yeah, I don't much. I was thinking this week, and I just felt like it is good to think big picture. It is good to think about societal problems, but I just came back to this thought, localize your joy, localize your lament, localize your thinking, and I mean, it's just all these individual localized factors that contribute to a statistic changing over time, So yeah, you could find trends, and those trends could apply, but I like to think about the people in my life, and how they have pursued family or not pursued family, or why not, and why that, and how thinking through that might help me love them better or encourage them better. But that, I'm not here to discount postulating big picture numbers. I'm not here to do that. I'm not being a troll here. So
No, I just think it's fun to talk about, but clearly, as we've established and the listeners well aware, none of us are professionals or on any subject really, that we discuss on here. But just more food for thought, I guess.
Man, yeah, it's so hard to answer that question. I'm sure the reason is more geared selfishly than not, just because society's not all that great as a whole, especially the way we're going from my perspective. So I kind of doubt it has to do with people realizing they're not responsible enough for a kid, and probably has more to do with finances, time, stuff like that, which are all very valid. Is this wrong? I mean, you shouldn't, like, legitimately, I guess I'm asking, should you have a kid if you are not financially able to accommodate that kid and yourself, and if you're not responsible enough?
I will pass down some advice that I was given, which is if you waited to where you were ultimately financially in a good spot, you would never have kids, because that point, as you grow older or as you pay off this thing or that point is always changing. Now, I will preface that there are situations that maybe you do have a lot of loan, credit card loan, student loan, car loan, whatever that might be challenging or that you wouldn't want to do. And kids definitely do have demands on your finances, but I think ultimately if we waited to where we were at a place where we're comfortable enough financially to start having kids, almost no one would start having them.
That's a fair point, for sure.
Although this isn't to discount, I think setting goals of like, I want to pay off this before I do that, like, those are reasonable and worthwhile.
So if there is a quick answer to this, when should you have kids?
Oh,
Yeah. Do you see yourself being with a significant other for more than 5 years? That's a difficult thing to know, but if there's some people
Wow.
who can confidently answer no to that question, and if you can answer no to that question, I would, really try to push against any decisions towards children, because, I think it's hard to think about a human being that hasn't entered the world yet, but if you can, I think that's helpful.
That's an excellent, phenomenal point. Good way to think about it. Definitely.
And you can't. I mean, sometimes mental illness hits a significant other or tragedy strikes, and you just can't predict everything. But I do think that there is responsible thinking that can happen, and a lot of it contributes to people not having a healthy understanding of sex from the get-go, and there's a lot of fingers to point when it comes to that topic as well. So
True. Great point. Dang. Yeah, that's excellent. Excellent point, as usual.
So I think this does relate a bit, but could I read this quote that I had on deck here and wanted to hear both of your thoughts? So I'm going to read it, and I'm just going to open up. I want to hear what you guys think. It's on page 118. Each person's private trouble cannot be solved by a social revolution, because revolutions are destabilizing and dangerous.
it's around that same point in the paragraph. He's talking about basically we're pushing the limits of society to become ever more accepting, or we're trying to include smaller and smaller groups into this society, but it has the potential to destabilize tradition in order to fit in smaller and smaller numbers of people. I do think that it's a good point noting that each person's private problems cannot be solved by social revolution. So, yeah, I guess it's not an easy subject to approach, because the last thing we want to be seen as is exclusive or not willing to accommodate to include people in things. But at the same time, how much chaos or destabilization are you willing to tolerate? And I think the heart of the matter, he lays this out, is that we simply don't understand why what we're doing works. I could say I don't understand how society works. I'm starting to do the reading and learning of how we got to where we are and why it works, but I would say that I don't understand how this very delicate dance, this intricate dance works very well.
Well, I guess I don't really have too much to add. I don't know. I don't really have anything better to say, I guess. What do you think, Austin, though? Yeah.
When do we know when we need a social revolution?
Perhaps when the suffering is too great. Or before that. It would be before that, actually.
Right, so I want to talk a little bit more about locality. And there's a universality in locality. All I'm saying is everyone has a local. Everyone has relationships, everyone has neighbors, right? So if this so-called social revolution in the queue is needed in many different localities in this region that we're talking about, then I think social revolution might be necessary. Let's think about the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. He sparked a revolution because there was a lot of localities that were suffering, and there was a universality in that. And people were like, yeah, me too. I'm experiencing this. I'm experiencing that segregation is not giving me equal opportunity, And like, historically, people, not when it was happening, but now people are like, yeah, that was a necessary social revolution, right? So I think Peterson has a very interesting point here, and it's a very important point. But I do think we need to figure out when we need social revolutions, and I think Patrick's answer was great. When the suffering has gotten to be too much, and you have to define too much.
But it would probably be before that. When the suffering's too much, the revolution should
chaos
have
is already knocking at the door. It's too late.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Pat.
Yeah. Which could be right now, as a matter of fact. Could be right now.
And it shut me down, but I really want to say this. Shut me down if this is not okay. But it's really difficult when you have two political sides in this country, the United States, that won't listen to each other. One side is focused on keeping society together, keeping tradition moving, keeping the things that are working continue to working, and it's not worth, like he says, it's not worth a social revolution for every person's private problem because we'll have chaos. But then the other side is we need to figure out where the suffering is and what we can do about it, And people just aren't really listening to each other. And I'm not trying to get divisive into this, but I think it is helpful. And something I love about Peterson is that he maps political leanings onto personalities. So there are some personalities that would lean more to one side, and that thinking that way has helped me so much, because it's not like, oh, this person's just a bigot, or oh, this person is just about virtue signaling, or it might have a lot to do with their personality, and that helps me have more empathy and helps me want to learn from their perspective instead of trying to prove them wrong. And I know we're talking about some very difficult conversations, and we're talking about things that light people up, but we need to have some tools for it.
That's important for the people on those far ends of the spectrum, because if you talk to someone with a different leaning than you and they're very critical and they're just shutting you down, naturally you're going to lean more into what you already believe or become more strongly rooted in that, even at the expense of being reasonable or being likable or whatever it is. If people are challenging something that you believe and they're doing it in a hostile way, that's not going to make you more open to what they're having to say. That's going to make you more entrenched in what you're currently espousing or believing. So not only a good observation, but a good prescription even, I think, Austin, of conversations that can be had.
To your point, Logan, if there is no room for redemption in your ideology, then there's really no possibility for peace.
Wow.
Can you say that again, actually?
If there's no room for redemption in your ideology, then there's really no possibility for peace. And when I say peace, I mean psychological peace. I mean peace amongst your neighbors. I mean peace in society.
Peace is a mystery. Violence is the default.
Peace is a person. So that thing I just said has come from, thinking quite a bit about critical race theory, and thinking about its pros and its cons and its limitations and its helpful tools, thinking about both sides of it. And I think it comes down to, do you want peace in society? Like, maybe you don't. Maybe you just want your ideology to come true. And we saw that in the Soviet Union, and we saw that in Hitler's regime, Like, you need to ask yourself that question. But if there's no redemption in your ideology, you're going to go down one path. Those two paths meet at the end, right or left politically, man. There's no redemption.
That was a very good point.
What do we think is so powerful about redemption? Why is that resonating with you?
Well, it has everything to do with what I say I believe, I guess. Believing in Jesus and his redemption for humanity and creation as a whole.
Yeah.
And as it relates to peace.
Yeah. That's like a breath of fresh air, hearing that, man. That's like breathing in truth.
I'm going to be thinking about that one for a while.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's book club discussion. Please let us know if you have any suggestions as to books we should read or topics we should discuss by contacting us at beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. We hope you join us next week for another conversation.